Alright, good evening, Internet serfs. Okay, I know that it's Sunday, and one of the things I've discovered is that there are times when I need to take a Sabbath just like anybody else. Okay, but as far as, a hard and fast rule about, whether I'm preaching, whether I'm marketing, what have you. The thing is, the Lord is teaching me that as part of the process of establishing my brand on the internet. And remember, I've said that the internet is my pulpit, generally my pulpit. My congregation has yet to show up, okay? Because, frankly, I don't consider that I have a congregation yet. If you're just looking at this video as like random traffic, you're not part of my congregation, okay? My congregation is made up of both Christians and non-Christians, but I can only establish a congregation when I get credibility. And I can only get credibility if I get customers. Okay? Remember, one of the propositions for Veritasia Ministries is Veritasia Ministries is effectively, it's a brand. Okay? It's a brand. And what I'm actually doing here is producing product, eventually product for sale, but at the moment what I'm trying to do is the reason I'm making so much of this material public without quote unquote asking for the sale has to do with just laying the groundwork for some of my opening biases. All right. So tonight I got an insight on what I want to define as, a concept I call the war of art. Okay. The war of art. Okay. The war of art, you could put it this way, the war on art is part and parcel of another concept that I call the apocalypse fever. Okay? And let's back up and let's just assume that I'm talking to my Christian friends only for just a moment, because it's not going to make sense to you if you don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and all that. Okay? That it's not going to make sense to you. So basically, I'm speaking here for Christians only. And I'm trying to speak in a way that I will not have to regret later when I get, mass media attention about what I'm really trying to say. Okay. I find myself thinking, well, yeah, I would love to, for example, make an appearance on Trinity Broadcasting Network, but in order to do that, I need to be able to have a mass effective message. Okay, and this is one of the limits about using human technology to get there. Okay, I need to have a mass effective message, which means a message that is not generally harmful to the general public, or it actually has a beneficial effect on on large groups of people. That's how you get to the point of, uh, being a televangelist. It's not just a matter of of setting yourself in front of a camera, because that's what I'm doing that right now, is my point. And I'm doing that, so far as I know, back when I don't have any any actual audience. Okay, but let me give you an example of one of the things that really ticks me off about the war of art. Okay, most I hate to say this, but most ignorant Christians, when they are taught to attack a property like Harry Potter, it's not just that they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, it's basically one of the objections that I have to the whole scientific scientific Darwinist naturalism is, first of all, there's a point where Darwinism, and I've documented this elsewhere on site. There's an interview on my channel right now by Philip E. Johnson, a lawyer who basically looked into this whole question, and more or less his work, there are people who credit his work with having spawned the whole so-called intelligent design movement. But okay, one of the things that I know to be evil, all right, in terms of like Mass Effects on John Q. Public, is that I believe that the devil, whether you believe in a conscious devil or not, okay, whether you believe in a conscious personal devil or not, I believe that the devil laughs all the way to the bank just because he can get both sides of this debate, okay, into an attitude which says, well, it's obvious, it's quote unquote obvious that if you believe in God, you're basically being deliberately, consciously ignorant of what I, as a practicing scientist intellectual, okay, claim to know about the universe. The problem with that, as Mr. Johnson points out, the problem with that as a lawyer is that it translates as what's known as an a priori assumption, which is just basically something you've agreed to accept as fact without it having been proved in and of itself. Okay? And see, intuitively, when you take it on an individual emotional level, it ought to be obvious that eventually this leads into incivility, because I don't like anybody taking the premise that, quote unquote, because you believe this, it means that you are being deliberately stupid. No, what it means is you're not a specialist. Okay? What it means is you're not a specialist in a given field. Okay. My objection to Ayn Rand, for example, is that I believe that her arguments about perfect functioning of the individual rational human mind would have worked just fine if, for example, there were no such thing as subconscious motivation. Okay? And the problem with telling people not to fake reality is if you take that out, and I understand the point, I understand without knowing how to express some of them yet, the points I believe she was making about, really there oughtn't to be any difference between quote unquote feeling and thought, between emotion and thought. Okay. That one of her points was that anybody who is calling on you to act because you are quote unquote feeling without thinking, okay, is not just being irrational, they're doing evil, they're trying to force your mind. Okay, that much of her premises I agree with. What I believe with absolute faith is that if Jesus Christ is God, then when Ayn Rand died, she came into an encounter with the actual individual who had the nail scars in his hands. Okay, and what I mean by judge not, ladies and gentlemen, what I mean by judge not is that the question of, quote unquote, whether Ayn Rand would make it into heaven has to do with once she is confronted with that reality, if it is a reality, okay, always assuming that it is a reality. Now, I will grant you that I believe it is a reality. Okay? And without getting into the question of quote unquote, whether it's a material reality, etc., etc. Okay? Or exactly what dimension of the multiverse are you in when you get to heaven? Okay, without even getting into definitions like that. See, I like playing in that gray area territory, but that doesn't mean I'm going to change my theology. Okay, that's one of the things that ticks me off because, for example, scientific inquiry that depends on this philosophical Darwinistic naturalism, okay, if you happen to enjoy science fiction, then the bias in science fiction, or the bias in the tradition of science fiction as it has existed up to now, is basically, eventually we're going to, quote unquote, philosophically outgrow this notion that there is a God. Okay, that gets back to M theory. Okay, I don't understand M theory. All right, I'm just saying that I can produce a symbolic proof for why I believe M theory is not necessarily, quote unquote, wrong in and of itself, but it's either meaningless or flawed. Okay. It's either meaningless or flawed. Um, what I believe the Blessed St. Jack was on about was that, he wanted to approach all of his scientific friends, and one has to assume that he had scientific friends because the man wrote science fiction. Okay, he used a brilliant couple of different brilliant scientific speculations, if you like, to write both the Narnia books and his space trilogy. And yes, he was willing to take all the heat for all of that. Okay, and this guy who never claimed to be a theological expert, when he had codified what he actually wanted to say. See, this is one of the outcomes I'm looking for in my life. When he codified what he actually wanted to say, he arguably became one of the most brilliant theologians of the 20th century. Okay, end of discussion. So anyway, but to give you an example, here's where I started. There's this concept that I choose to call the war of art. And what I'm holding up here is a DVD case for one of those movies that I personally happen to love. Okay, I believe it was brilliantly done. But in the strictest theological sense, you could sit here and make the argument that, quote unquote, this is a movie that real Christians should not see. Okay? Why? Because it's about Halloween, and there are people like, for example, Carmen is famous for, part of his Mission 316 campaign was all about helping to convince Christian young people that they should not celebrate Halloween. Okay? Now, the thing is, Carmen knows enough about theology that he can make a claim like that and make it in the mass marketplace and make it stick. Okay? Because he knows certain things about how symbols work. He knows certain things about producing symbols musically, producing videos, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm not saying that Carmen is not doing the will of God when he encourages Christian kids not to celebrate Halloween, or Christian parents not to teach it, or whatever. What I'm saying is, this is a brilliantly done movie. Okay? This is a brilliantly done movie, and yet, a generation or less ago, the general Christian community, or at least the evangelical Christian community in America, a generation or less ago, used to have this huge problem with movies in general, as in the entire movie industry is about glorifying a materialistic lifestyle. So then you get into the ethical spectrum of some people say that some movies are okay just because they enjoy them on an emotional level, and that's one ethical position. Okay, but there's also another ethical position that, quote unquote, it is a sin to be seen inside a movie house at all. Okay, now the thing is, I'd like to think our culture has grown away from that, except that historically they used to say the same thing about actors in general because of what the Bible said about hypocrites. Okay, they used to say the same thing about William Shakespeare. All right? And the reason they used to say this was, first it started out from don't do any acting at all. Then you move from that to, well, what if we're acting out what if we're acting out the Passion play? What if we're acting out the Passion of the Christ? Okay? And this goes back to, watch this, Mel Gibson did a brilliant movie on the Passion of the Christ. On the one hand, his interpretation, because it had all of its theological symbols and its theological premises correct, was very very much immune from criticism by people who believed in those premises. On the other hand, there is also another very famous movie called The Last Temptation of Christ. Okay? Now, the problem is, it's not enough to sit here and say, well, Christians shouldn't see this movie. It's not enough to say that, because the moment you say that as a hard and fast rule, the moment you say that the film The Last Temptation of Christ was a 100% act of blasphemy and sin, okay, once you say that, even as a Christian who disagrees with its primary premises on whatever level you disagree with it, okay, the problem with disagreeing with it, so intensely as a layman, is that eventually the political hoorah over The Last Temptation of Christ drew more attention to it than it deserved. Okay, that's what I mean by the war of art. And I've heard preaching over the years that, like, for example, effectively the people who were responsible for the space program, or right around the time of the Challenger disaster, I think it was, the people who were responsible for the space program, basically God was taking vengeance on them because what they were trying to do was to quote unquote reconstruct something with the same sin of pride involved as the Tower of Babel. Okay, that's another example of what can happen theologically when someone looks at a scientific achievement and makes that kind of criticism. Okay. I choose to believe that there is almost no such thing as what might be called conscious evil. Okay, there are individual acts of sin, and I'm not saying there isn't a problem with non-Christian sinning, Christian sinning, whatever. I'm not saying that while we're here in time that quote unquote the entirety of the sin problem has been dealt with in such a way that it turns us into robots. Okay, that's eventually what it comes to. The problem with not struggling with sin is that, or not caring about sin, or taking as a primary premise that quote unquote there is no such thing as sin, which is one of the primary implications of, say, materialistic naturalism. Okay. Materialistic naturalism, if there is no God, then how can anything be a sin? Okay, if there is no God, then not only did Hitler die absolutely dead and have no destiny in eternity, which I'm assuming that most Christians in the 20th and 21st centuries would prefer to think of Hitler being in hell. I make this point because okay, I make this point because basically Jack Lewis made this same point in The Great Divorce, only he chose to use Napoleon as his illustration. Okay, and it was interesting because the way Napoleon was being quote unquote punished in hell was he was walking around this vast illusory mansion, okay, marching up and down all the time, saying it was such and so's fault, no, it was this other person's fault, no, it's this other person's fault over here, and he was not able to stop it. Okay, he was not able to stop it. So that's just one creative extrapolation of the way to punish Napoleon. Right? It doesn't necessarily take fire and brimstone, although that's a more conventional symbology. But anyway, back to my point. See, the problem is that, for example, I'm becoming convinced that basically we cannot necessarily always detect where the devil has gotten into the details of any given creative work. Okay, there is such a thing as using creative work from Christian premises, which is why I approve of processes like Generation Entertainment, Matt Crouch's outfit, what is it, Sherwood Films, etc., etc. Okay, but I guess the primary premise that I'm trying to get at is that any argument that ever ends up, regardless of your opening theological bias, any argument that ever ends up as, well, if you believe X, Y, Z, then you're being deliberately stupid about something obvious. Okay. The reason that argument really ticks me off is that it's too easy for both sides of that argument to get, to get so disrespectful and just ignore the whole idea of human dignity or basic civility. In other words, they're ignoring a basic foundation of the way the universe actually works. So, so both sides are equally engaged in evil. See, this is part of what we mean by saying that as we humans need to come to understand it, okay, once you reach the divine level, there is no gradation between one sin and another. There are no levels. Sin equals sin equals sin equals sin equals sin. Okay, that is one of the problems that humans have with getting their minds around that whole idea, is that basically, okay, to put it in its most extreme possible terms so I can make my point, okay, the argument for why I need to cooperate with God is that, basically, without knowing, okay, here's where I run into a problem. See, without knowing Jesus, there's a theological foundation that if there are no levels of sin in what God considers the proper way of understanding sin, then it's not just that I have the capacity as a human being to be Adolf Hitler, but one of the opening postulates of Christianity is that without the intervention of God, I would be Adolf Hitler. Okay? and again, that is a comment I'm directing specifically to my Christian friends, because they are the only ones who have any hope of understanding it. Okay, but that's one of the things we don't understand about the nature of eternity. Okay, and that's one of the things I'm coming to believe that C.S. Lewis wanted to understand about the relationships between time and choice. Well, basically what he was given by divine revelation, I believe, was that it's impossible to understand the full relationship between choice and time until you're beyond both. Okay, until you're actually in eternity. Or above that particular system, or whatever. Have I described some of the necessary attributes of heaven? Maybe. Okay, but my limitation is that I'm using as a model a very specific artistic construct. Okay, so that one of the things that Jack Lewis, and here is my disclaimer about that. I think what he said in The Great Divorce was the last thing I want any of my audience to believe is that I have some kind of superior access to the details about the afterworld. I have no idea what awaits us, is basically what he said. Okay. So, anyway, all I'm saying is, here is a brilliant movie. Okay, two very big thumbs up, say, Ebert and Roper, and it's right here on their blurb. Okay, my question, as far as like the War of Art, is, do you think Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg were, quote-unquote, doing the will of God when they made this film? Okay. My tentative answer is yes. I believe the same thing about why and or how George Lucas made Star Wars. Okay, I believe he was following after his ruling passion, working from the best moral framework that he knew. Therefore, it's almost like by definition he was doing the will of God. Okay? The man is not a Christian, ladies and gentlemen. He's not an explicit Christian. Okay? But expecting him to be an explicit Christian before God will ever speak to him may be an error. Okay? Lewis's postulate was that God is speaking to basically everyone all the time. Okay, but one of the definitions of the damned is that they eventually can't hear that. Through whatever process, they come to a point where they cannot hear that. They can no longer accept any good. They can no longer accept any good if God is the source of all that is good. They can no longer accept any good. That's what defines the damned. Okay. So, basically, yeah, it's turning into a long lecture again. I'm just trying to set up, again, speaking into a mirror, trying to set up a primary premise. Okay, so a lot of points here. I'm probably repeating myself. The reason you can now access this information for free is that I still need the traffic. Okay, but eventually, a lot of this information is potentially going, not just to be taken down, but actually canned and boxed up as, quote unquote, the first product of this ministry. Okay, but I need to learn how to have a beneficial effect on an individual level, and I need to learn how to have a beneficial effect on a mass level. That's what I'm learning, not just about marketing, but about the whole process of ministry in general. Okay, and one of the things I do know is that everything God wants me to do proceeds precept on precept, line upon line. Okay, it starts small and it gets bigger from there. But remember, what I'm actually doing is I'm actually putting myself on record and creating product. Okay, so there's an extent to which I'm doing good marketing just by putting the product out there. Okay, there's an extent to which I'm doing good theology because theology is what I want to do with my life, even though I'm not a theological expert in the conventional sense. I'm suspecting that I may have to become one, which is one of the interesting boundaries of the magic. And that's the thing. I'm really trying to find an outer boundary for what it is that God wants me to do. Okay, but the problem is that with God being infinite and I'm a finite creature, you see, there again, there's a point where the symbols break down, or where all answers deceive, as St. Jack said. Anyway, okay, what I'm saying is that to say that Robert Zemeckis is being an idiot because he's not a Christian yet, or to say that Steven Spielberg is being an idiot because he's not a Christian yet, okay, that kind of an attitude, when you follow it out, it leads to book burning, which is that ought to be obvious even to the guy who just became a Christian yesterday, that kind of judging people, the reason it's forbidden is because it's actively evil. Okay, I'm not saying consciously evil, but it is actively evil. Okay. The first reason not to judge is that you don't know all the details for how a given person got there. And that applies to, whatever position they have in life. It applies to whether they're Christians or not, whether they're working or not, or whether their work is, quote unquote, intended for a good purpose or an evil purpose. Okay. As my friend and mentor Julia Cameron used to say, God, I'll take care of the quantity, you need to take care of the quality of the work. Okay. So that is my prayer as well. All right, good night, Internet serfs.